Hello, and welcome to Train Signal. This is the lab setup for the Windows 7 deployment course. In this lesson, I want to talk a little bit about the corporate scenarios that we're going to use throughout the entire course. Then, just so you can follow along and set up your own lab environment, I'll show you how I have my hardware and my software configured and exactly what versions of software I'm using. And I'll finish this up with my lab goals. The corporate scenarios, I've chosen to use a couple of different corporate scenarios. The first is Wired Brain Coffee, just a small 20-computer shop, not a lot going on there. They're not an SA or a software assurance client. They're definitely not an enterprise client, so they wouldn't have software like Configuration Manager or System Center Configuration Manager. We'll start with Wired Brain Coffee and show you how to set it up in a smaller environment using the manual tools, all command line driven from the Windows Automated Installation Kit. Then, in some of the larger scenarios, we'll be using Green Lizard Books. Now, quite often, I've shortened this to just GLB, you'll notice, for domain names and such. But this is a really big corporate environment. This has over 20,000 computers, and we have offices on almost every single continent. Now, of course, that introduces some interesting issues. Some of the offices are well connected. Well, probably everybody at the corporate headquarters is well connected, but you've got some of those small branch offices that are not well connected. So I want to show you how the deployment tools work in all three of these environments. Number one, small computer shop. Number two, huge organization that has corporate offices with well-connected computers, and those poor little branch offices that couldn't download an image across their WAN link to save their life. So there's different features in the various deployment products that I'll cover to help you get your deployment solution up and running in the quickest amount of time possible and as reliable as possible. In my environment, I'm using VMware, just keeping everything virtual. I love snapshots. I'm the kind of person who always has to click on a button to see what's going to happen. I've learned that snapshots should always be taken before you push that button you're questioning whether or not it's going to blow up the machine or not. So I'm a big believer in virtual environments. Now, just because I'm using a virtual environment in this course doesn't mean you can't also set all of this up in a virtual environment as well. It works exactly the same as long as you have network connectivity. To start with, I have one server. This server is my domain controller. It's running DNS, and it also has DHCP set up with a scope of IP addresses to hand out to all of its clients. If we dive a little deeper into the domain controller, you'll find out that his IP address is 10.10.10.5. We have a 24-bit subnet mask, and there's no default gateway because I'm on a single subnet. The domain name is going to change from one scenario to the next. When we get into MDT, the domain name will be deploy. When we're into Config Manager, the domain name will be GLB for, Green Lizard Books. So the domain name can change based from one scenario to the next. Now, for that small environment, the Wired Brain Coffee, my domain controller is also running Windows Automated Installation Kit version 2.0, Microsoft Deployment Toolkit 2010 Update 1, and Windows Deployment Services. Now, in the real world, it's not advisable to have only one domain controller. If that guy fails, you're in a world of trouble. So usually you always need to have two domain controllers. In a production environment, I think that's pretty standard today, 2 or more. In your test environment, especially if you're using VMware with their snapshot technology, then you can always roll back to an earlier version if something does go awry on that domain controller. Otherwise, you can run all of these tools on that one server. When we get into some of the more intricate software, that would be System Center Configuration Manager, that should not, and portions of it cannot be installed on a domain controller. Therefore, I'll have a member server. That member server will get his IP address from the DHCP server running on the domain controller. The domain name will be GLB for the Config Manager portion. We'll also install SQL Server and Configuration Manager on that member server. Then, just to show you how to integrate all the services together, We'll make sure the wake is installed. I'll show you how to integrate MDT 2010 Update 1 into Config Manager, as well as Windows Deployment Service, or WDS. But all of that is going to be running on the member server. The software that I'll be using, the server operating system, will be Windows Server 2008 R2, and I highly recommend that you always use the latest and greatest server operating system. That's usually the one that comes with all the bells and whistles, and I'll be telling you about those bells and whistles throughout the whole course. That server will need networking functionality, and you need a good deal of hard drive space. Remember, you're going to be storing images. You're going to be playing around with images, so you'll be creating more than one. I think you should at least have 100 gigs of hard drive space to start with, and hard drive space is pretty cheap today. My lab setup is a single Active Directory domain, but in all the tools, I explain how you can set it up for multi-domain environments as well. I'm also going with a single subnet. And I'm using the 180-day free trial version of all the software. And you can do the same. Free downloads from Microsoft. My lab goals are to keep the physical and network structures as simple as possible so we can concentrate on the technologies and not have to troubleshoot going through routers and firewalls and gateways. I just want to keep it simple. That's why I'm using a single Active Directory domain and a single subnet. And that wraps up the lab setup for the Windows 7 Deployment Training course.